everyone. Delighted to have you join us for this latest Longevity Forum event, where I'm even more delighted to be joined by Rowland Smith, who's going to be talking about the philosophy of longevity. For those of you new to the Longevity Forum, we were set up around 4 years ago, and the aim was to try and stimulate debate and raise awareness about longevity issues in general. And our focus is mainly on the science, the economics, the policy, and the business. But of course, longevity is one of those most intimate human trends, and it's a lot more than just the science and the economics. Hence our series of podcasts around the history of longevity and art by Father Michael, and today's event with Robert. Now, for me, coming at this from an economic point of view, what I'm struck with about longevity is sort of two dimensions. The first is about the numbers of people living long lives. The first time ever in human history, people born today can expect to live a long, long life in high-income countries. And that's never been the case before. So the majority can expect to live a long life, which of course means we have a new imperative, which is to age well. And some of that, of course, is about health, but it raises the question, what is it to age well? And then the other thing that's happening, not just the number of people reaching old age, but actually how long those lives are becoming. If you look at the last ONS data that the UK government agency produces, the majority of children born today can expect to live into their 10th decade, if not beyond. So that's a lot more life. So that's interesting as economists, because how do we respond to that? But what's also interesting is that it means you're shining a light on a part of the life course that economics tends not to look at. Now, of course, while economics doesn't look at that part of life, the humanities have for a long time been looking at the process of aging and living a long life, because people have lived long lives before, just not in such numbers and to such an extent. And so that's why I'm delighted to have Robert joining us. Robert is a polymath. I think is any word I can use to describe, well, many words I could use to describe Robert, but polymath is definitely one of them. Always fascinating to talk to. I worked out, Robert, that I've known you for more than 2/3 of my life. I think it's asymptoting to 1, that number, but we've known each other for a very long time. In fact, Robert is actually technically my twin, which, if that brings to mind that wonderful Danny DeVito and Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, that's great. And it's kind of like an academic equivalent of that, to be honest, because we're both elected as prize fellows to All Souls at the same time. Myself as an economist, and Robert, philosophy and literature, studying Derrida. A really interesting career, done many, many things, involved in many organizations. I highlight 7 books he's written on Derrida, on Freud, on poetry, books about Breakfast with Socrates and Driving with Plato, about what the classic philosophers tell us about life. But if you're going to do one thing on the back of today, I would encourage you to buy and read Robert's extraordinary book, Autobiophilosophy, an intimate story of what it means to be human. And you can see in that that title why I wanted Robert to come in and help me discuss about the philosophy of longevity. So thank you, Robert, for joining us.
Thanks, Andrew. Nice to see you.
Now, I said earlier that, for me, economics lacks a theory of aging. In fact, really what economics has as a theory of aging is a health, that we make different decisions at different ages because our health changes. And that's pretty incomplete. And of course, health is just one of the variables that defines aging. And if we are hopefully aging better, then perhaps it'll have less of a role to play. And if we're living longer lives and have more time ahead of us, we'll also think about things differently. And it seems to me that, of course, at the heart of longevity really is the notion of the passage of time. And, does that change us? We hear a lot about, 60 being the new 50, because that's focusing on aging as a health phenomenon. But in a way, if 60 was the new 50, it would be a bit disappointing, wouldn't it? That's 10 years of your life you haven't made the most of. So I think you wanted to start our discussion by talking about longevity and wisdom, which I think is a great place to begin, because wisdom does seem to be about something to do with the passage of time. So why did you want to start there, Robert? What were your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And, maybe we can do this more as a conversation, I hope, rather than me just kind of speaking straight to camera. I suppose I wanted to start with the notion of wisdom because it's the thing, one of several things often connoted with old age, or at least older age. We have this idea that we get wiser as we get older, but then we also have the notion of second childhood, and in kind of sadder cases, other phenomena like dementia and so on. So we have pretty contrary popular notions of what goes on with age. On the one hand, becoming wiser; on the other hand, becoming more silly. And I was just what popped into my mind there was this rather depressing Philip Larkin poem called "The Old Fools," which is a kind of sorry tale of what it's like to get older and the kind of reversals that go on with that. So that's why I wanted to talk about wisdom, wisdom in old age, and what wisdom is actually, and how we define it. Is it different from being clever or intelligent, and so on? But actually, just before coming on to that, I was really struck by what you just said then about the passage of time. And I wasn't planning to start here, but nothing like starting with a digression, like most of my car journeys. It made me think actually of the famous book by Marcel Proust, In Search of Lost Time, à la recherche du temps perdu, where he talks about just how important memory is as we get older. And I was connecting that immediately with what is being discovered these days about memory, and what is thought about it in psychoanalysis, and what Freud says about memory. And it's a rather odd set of thoughts, really, but at the heart of it is the idea that there is no such thing as a perfectly accurate memory, and that we are slightly kidding ourselves as we get older, or indeed at any point in our lives, if we think our recall will be pure and objective and disinterested. Because whenever we remember something, there's always subjective interest in it. So we select and deselect, and for different purposes. We select to make ourselves feel better, or deselect to exclude things which make us feel bad. So if we've got embarrassing events in our past, we might well want to redact those and focus on the things that made us feel better, or vice versa, depending on our personality. But what made me think of that, I suppose, was this idea that, yes, as we get older and time passes, we've got more to remember, essentially. But that the process of remembering is not as pure and naive as we might think. It's not just about, do we remember or don't we remember? And I think sometimes, when we talk about old people with memory issues or dementia and what have you, I think we've got sometimes a rather simplistic view of what memory is, as if only those people could remember events as they happened. Whereas the truth is, nobody ever remembers the same event in the same way, because people remember it for different reasons. And what Freud says about the memory is that, well, among a billion things that Freud says about memory, one of the things, at least that I remember him saying about remembering, is that we always revise, and the process of revision begins in the blink of an eye. So there's no memory which isn't always already revised. So the idea of getting back to the pure event, unmediated, untrammeled, undoctored by our own interests, is a myth. Now that's the bad news. The good news, the good news is, if we can never remember exactly what happened objectively, then we always have the capacity to retell an event in a way that suits us. Now, that might sound Orwellian, because we're retelling the past according to our own personal interests or personal ideological interests. But on the other hand, it's also a source of consolation in some way. We can keep retelling stories from the past, reframing them, bringing them under new lights, as it were, in order to expose different things about what was happening then and who we were at the time, and so on. So that's an opening digression, Andrew, before even starting to talk about wisdom. But that's the thing that came to mind just when you use that phrase, the passing.
I think that's interesting too, because one of the dangers with any form of aging is stereotypes, and wisdom, of course, sounds very positive. It's a great thing, and of course, clearly longer lives give greater time for adult development. But what you're hinting at there with the memory is sort of that adult development may not be, that Pindell thing about, become what you are, but actually who you are is going to be evolving. And even in reconstructing your memories, you're going to be reconstructing who you are in terms of who you are now, and then rechanging who you were in the past.
It's exactly right. So to adapt that phrase, which I associate also with Nietzsche, become who you are, it's also a question of becoming who you were. And that's, and we'll go on to talk about imagination, I think a bit later if we have the time. But in a way, we can retell stories of ourselves. And you probably know this, in the process of psychoanalysis, one of the main technologies of psychoanalysis is to reframe experiences so that they're not told in a light which is abject or depressing or what have you. Not simply to cheer people up, but because there are a million different ways to refract a particular story, and some can be more consoling than others, I suppose. But onto this question of wisdom. I mean, Andrew, you mentioned that you and I had this sort of Oxford experience, and of course, Oxford, like a lot of universities, Western universities in particular, I suppose, they recruit students not based on wisdom, but on cleverness, essentially. So how clever is this person? And of course, other things are taken into account, but cleverness is really the heart of it, or intelligence, if we can use those words synonymously for now, at least. But interestingly, if you think about the origins of the university, I'm thinking particularly of the academy and Aristotle and Plato and Socrates. What they were seeking were not clever students to make even cleverer, but young, kind of younger minds with the kind of plasticity and openness with whom they could develop wisdom. And that was really the origin of the university, and certainly the origin of philosophy is about the development of wisdom rather than cleverness per se. And the word philosophy, as I'm sure you know, if we were to translate it more or less literally, means a love of wisdom. The sophos bit means wisdom rather than cleverness. So what is this wisdom thing? And one place we can start is by thinking about that tradition, the tradition of the kind of classical philosophers, particularly Plato and Aristotle. And I think we can contrast it with the modern version, because I think the modern version of wisdom, when we think of wisdom, we think it's probably a combination of, maybe some cleverness, but experience. It's those two things together. So somebody's wise if they've had a lot of experience and they're able to have some kind of insight into it. So maybe actually insight is a better word than cleverness. It's let's say experience plus insight equals wisdom. If you wanted a formula, I guess, for what we call wisdom today. And we kind of think, well, experience is not something you can have as a young person. It's something that accumulates over time. So, logically you'd say older people are more likely to be wise because they're more likely to have more experience. And if they can combine that with insight, hey presto, we have a wise old person. So that's the modern version, I think, of what wisdom is. And I want to come back to that and question it a bit, actually. But just to contrast for a moment, I think what the kind of Socratic notion of wisdom is, which isn't really to do with experience at all. And it's as available to young people as it is to old people. What wisdom is, I think, from my understanding of Plato, and particularly Plato and Socrates, is that wisdom is about access to the truth. And of course, we can debate, what on earth do we mean by the truth? It's hardly a innocuous term, but that's for them what wisdom is. And they contrast it with sophistry, which is cleverness, basically. So you can be as clever as you like, but the trouble is, the cleverer you are, almost the less wise you're likely to be. They don't quite put it like that, but there is there's a sort of tension between the two. So they talk a lot about rhetoric and sophistry. Like the more you deploy rhetoric, the more likely you are just to use clever arguments which are detached from truth. So for them, true wisdom is almost the opposite of cleverness and rhetorical skill and all of that, because those things like rhetorical skill get you wrapped up with your own cleverness and more detached from the truth, which is a much, how to put it, much more direct experience of I'm going to say something profoundly irritating, but the truth for Plato and Socrates is the truth is a direct experience of the true. And the true, yeah, not very helpful necessarily, but the true for them is something which is permanent, objective, real, doesn't vary according to worldly events, basically. Long answer, sorry.
Yeah, but isn't it Plato sort of says to philosophize is to learn to die? Is that sort of connected with that?
Yeah, I think that's right. And part of that phrase, and it's picked up by Montaigne as well, is, we learn how to die because we are able to jettison the unnecessary things we've picked up during life, all the chatter, the rhetoric, the cleverness, because in order to die well, we've got to be in a state of simplicity, really, and clarity and awareness of the truth, essentially. Yeah, so there is a real link there.
I pick up on that because this is very classical, isn't it? The sort of stages of life.
Yeah.
And I think Cicero talks about early life and our passions and our emotions drive us. But then as we get older, we contemplate rather than are active. But that seemed to sort of contrast what I say is sort of the modern version, where obviously it depends what age we're talking about now, but there's sort of a much greater focus on remaining active and being purposeful, and sort of reinventing and much more focused perhaps about the self rather than the contemplative.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? And that's right. There is that distinction between contemplation and action, via negativa and via positiva, as it's called sometimes in the religious tradition too, which takes it over. But actually, just to defend certainly Socrates for a moment, for him, the two were combined. Socrates was a man who was peripatetic. He wandered around the place. He wasn't stuck in a university or literally in an ivory tower like you and I were. He was out on the streets of Athens, regaling people with stories, buttonholing people, speaking truth to power, holding impromptu, what today we'd probably call brainstorms or webinars, what have you. And for him, the two he wouldn't have made that distinction, I don't think. For him, contemplation was a live dialogical activity. So it's interesting you and I have chosen to have an interview or a conversation here rather than a lecture, because to your point, really, wisdom, you can't become wise on your own, which I think is quite a sort of profound thought, really, that it's only in dialogue with somebody else, only using the dialectical method, that we can tease out what's true. So wisdom actually isn't about, sitting in a bath or a sauna until, you have a eureka moment. It is more about the to and fro and kind of allowing the truth to emerge from this contrast of content and style, I suppose.
But I also wanted to sort of think, a little bit about wisdom, about getting better at making decisions or better at knowing yourself. But, is that what it is? I mean, should we still be failing? I'm trying to get a contemplative world with that sense of activeness. And, you like Beckett, and, Beckett has that sort of, fail, try something, fail, try again, fail again, try again, fail better. Is that the wisdom, or is there something that, eventually the point of life is, oh, I get it all now, I understand it all? And what's your sense on that?
So with the Beckett thing, are you thinking with his, fail better next time or whatever it is? I can't remember.
Yeah, well, I'm going back to what you're saying about memory and sort of, and you and I knew Derek Parfit, All Souls, and Derek was about our sense of self is not as well defined as we think it might be.
Yeah.
And your point about memory absolutely picks it up in the sense that you're going to reconfigure your memories based upon who you are today, which may then create a different version of who you were in the past. And one of the things, the classical sort of view, my understanding of it is very much that you're heading towards almost a state of grace.
Yeah.
Whereas, the sort of sense of constantly reinventing or being someone different is where that Beckett quote comes in, or the Parfit evolution happens, the sort of a multi-stage versus tending to sort of a sense of I've arrived at who I actually am.
Yeah, I mean, the curveball in all of this, I think, is this word self, which is a relatively modern construct. And my understanding of it, it really comes about as an extrapolation of it in French of the reflexive verb, like, se brosser les dents, the person who brushes the teeth, they brush the self, so it's derived from a linguistic construct, but the notion of a self is actually relatively new, but it's an interesting question, is that something that develops over time or not? And I think what I'm trying to get at with this idea of revising memories about yourself is that actually you become rather detached from who that self is. Like, you're not invested in refining the self and becoming who you are, because you can let that go in a way. Or to put it in slightly more sort of self-help terms, maybe wisdom is about having less ego, and because the ego is about, very broadly speaking, positing the self all the time, and the self seeking affirmation of itself, or all the time.
It's only interesting if you look, looking at work-based skills practice, the general consensus that emerges from that is that, of course, as you age, your skill set changes, and in particular, as you get older, you're less ego-driven, you're better at cooperating with teams. These are all averages rather than something found in everyone, but there is that diminution of the ego. But I guess that also comes with a sense of adult development and maturity, because presumably something about maturity, which I know isn't the same as your definition of wisdom you're using, is about, you find it hard to sort of deceive yourself. And perhaps that comes both with understanding yourself and letting go of the ego.
Yeah, I think that, I do think that's right. If you think about, I mentioned Freud earlier. Freud's notion of the ego is very much associated actually with childhood. It's not really to do with the ego as we understand it every day today. We think of the ego as being somebody with a big ego, they want to have lots of attention, they need lots of affirmation and so on. And that's the thing probably that I think we do sort of begin to let go of a little bit as we get older. We care less about what other people think about us, ourselves, for a start. So I think we become a bit disburdened of that need for approval or affirmation. We're not so worried about it, which I think on the whole is probably a good thing. And I think that is probably partly what wisdom does.
I've got some great questions in the chat which I want to try and bring into, but before I do that, Robert, I want to also wonder about as life lengthens. So I got a couple of things I want to try and draw in here.
Yeah.
First is about as life, is it about the passage of time that's been or the passage of time to go? So Laura Carstensen, as a Stanford professor, has a wonderful socio-emotional selectivity theorem that says that the reason why older people tend to be happier, but SST, I believe it's called. Okay. The reason that older people are happier than those in middle age, whatever that is they focus less upon future goal-orientated tasks and more around emotional stability. So they start to prune their friendships and networks to those who provide greater positivity and greater stability, plus they're better at dealing with those shocks. And I do wonder, as we see, that statistic the UK government says that more than 50% of kids born today will live into their 90s, whether that means that you're going to start to do that later. So actually ego will still be more important it'll happen later. And then the other thing I wanted to think about was whether, in a world where most people died in the first 5 years of life or the first 50 years of life, and only about 1 in 6 made it through to 70, preparing for an imminent death was really important. So there was a big focus on the afterlife and, and getting ready. And that the classical ideas you had are very much about getting wisdom and understanding truth. I wonder if the fact that more and more people living longer means that we focus less upon the imminent afterlife and more about the rest of our life, and whether that is about ego or the aging well phenomenon.
Because there's so much in all of that, isn't there? Which thread to pick up? So if people are living longer, and on the assumption that as they live longer, their quality of life can be reasonably good too. So let's assume that with medicine and so on, people will not only live longer but live better, physically speaking. And we know that's not a given, but let's say that. Then that's probably true, isn't it? That there will be, as it were, the lifespan of the ego will expand accordingly, with the lifespan of the individual. What it makes me think, though, is it made me think about this notion of purpose, because it seems to me that what gives human beings meaning in life more than anything else, as well as relationship with others, with other human beings, is purpose, a sense of purpose. And these are the two principal sources of meaning in human life: relationship and purpose, essentially. And if we just focus on purpose, it seems to me one of the chief benefits of having a purpose in life is that it gives us something outside of ourselves to pursue. We want to, if it's you or me, we have a book to write. If you're an engineer, you've got a bridge to design. If you run a sports academy, you've got young people to train, whatever. You've got a purpose outside of yourself. And I think this is important because we don't want the ego. The ego is really just a strategic entity. We don't want it to become an object in itself. We want it just to resource us to be able to do those things, like pursue a purpose. And I think, and we know, I'm sure you've studied this, goodness me, we know that people who retire early often struggle because they lose a sense of purpose. So people, we're of a generation where we know people who have already retired. We're in our mid-50s. We will know people who've already retired, but we're also of a generation on a cusp where we wouldn't be at all surprised if our peers were still working when they're 80. So we're a kind of interesting midpoint there, cusp point there. But it does seem to me that one of the fundamental issues there is not having so much of an ego that the ego becomes the object in itself that we focus on. So we focus too much on ourselves. We need that purpose in order to give us meaning in life. And that for me would be the key thing. So in a longer life, and I think this is the background, during COVID, one of the unspoken things is lots of older people started dying earlier or being more affected about this was, this unspoken, or in some cases spoken, question of, well, they're old anyway. What purpose does a 70, 80, 90-year-old have in this world? If we're being, candid about it. So I think for me, that's the key thing here. It's how purpose becomes the thing that we keep alive in those.
I know you want to talk about imagination later. Of course, one of the ironies of talking about longer lives is we always run out of time to cover all the topics we want to. But you're going to talk about imagination later, and I know you're going to talk about that by imagination looking backwards. But I also think I'm very struck. You read your notes about that, about how people like Mark Freeman in Encore talk about biology flowing downhill, and how perhaps later life is also about going beyond the ego and helping the next generation coming through and imagining what's going to happen afterwards. But let me come to some of the questions we've got, and there's some very interesting ones which I will start. One question about memory, I think it came up, and this is from Lisa Melton, so thank you, Lisa, which is about Proust. What can we learn from Proust? a book that changed Lisa's life. I confess, Lisa, I think one of the things I'm hoping for a longer life is to actually get through Proust. So I'm not going to be able to contribute at all on this because I really am interested in the answer here. So Robert, what's your thoughts on this?
It's a good point, isn't it? You need a long life to read Proust. And I was wondering if Lisa, there's a little reference to Alain de Botton's book, which is called How Proust Changed My Life, or How Proust Can Change Your Life. Well, I suppose what I find fascinating about Proust, among many things, of course, is this idea of the idea that an event in our past is infinite, that we can look back at a certain event in our teens. So, say we have our first kiss when we're 16. We look back on that when we're 10 years later, and it has it might be embarrassing, for example, 10 years later. But 40 years later, when we look back on it, we might have a very different reaction to it. We might think it's sweet, or might have a very compassionate sense of ourselves as we look back on that. And the point I want to make is that I think Proust does this in his book. He takes a single moment, as we all know, where he's dipping his tea cake into a cup of tea, or whatever it is, tisane. And from the taste of the Madeleine, the whole book unfolds. So, in 1 second, there's a million words. And for me, I think that's probably what I was thinking of in terms of the memory and so on, that actually there is no end to the richness that we've already had in our past lives. And every event can be thought about and reevaluated in a million different ways with a million different nuances. So rather than thinking, life's behind me, what lies ahead, it gives me an enormous sense of the treasure we already have in reframing things. I also think this is a very odd reference. I know there's a 1970s cop thriller called The Conversation, starring Gene Hackman. I don't know if you remember that, Andrew.
Yeah.
It's about a policeman, I think, set in San Francisco. He's got a wiretap on these two people, and we hear this conversation played several times throughout the movie. It's a conversation between a man and a woman. And the first time you hear it, it's just completely innocuous. I can't remember what the content is. But as the movie goes on and you hear more and more context, you realize that they are actually planning I think it's a murder, but the first time you hear it, because you have none of the context, you have no idea. They just look like a nice couple and going through a pleasant afternoon walk through Union Square in San Francisco. And I think that is kind of how the memory works, and what Proust does. He adds more context to give more richness to what's past in life. So with that title, À la recherche du temps perdu, In Search of Lost Time, what he's finding in lost time are things that were already there. He's not just finding one event, which is unidimensional, but finding many dimensions in one event. So I suppose that for me is why, one of many reasons I like Proust.
And that's interesting too. I mean, is it Faulkner who says sort of the past is never past, it's never even finished? Is that sort of the
yeah, yeah? And I mean, she knows I do quite a lot of work in a kind of version of systemic therapy, and one of the things that comes up, of course, when we work with trauma in particular, is that one of the things that defines trauma is that it's a past that remains present. That's what makes trauma traumatic, is that it doesn't stay in the past, essentially. So it's never processed completely. And that, of course, can be the case for very positive events too. So Freud has this phrase, we repeat what we don't understand. And the chances are we'll go through life trying to reprocess things, negative and positive, in our life that were too much for us to compute at the time. So in a sense, we need a longer life in order to understand our earlier life. And of course, we do that all the time. Our process of self-understanding is constantly renewing as we get older.
Well, I'm very struck when I talk to sort of the psychologists about later life. I mean, this is just part of adult development. And you're saying that we need more time to develop and process and refine. And please do keep questions coming, because it's great to fold them in. And Cara's got one which, if Proust is looking backwards and bringing the past into the present and shadowing the future, there is this Janus-like nature about time. Do we look back or do we look forward? And I always, if I look at the aggregate UK data, the average Brit has never been so old, but has never had so many years left ahead of them. And I think that kind of is a nice way of thinking about, do we really have an aging society? Have I got more years ahead? Am I really older? And Carol's asked a question, how do we prepare children born today to think long-term about their future selves? And I think, Carol, this is, for me, absolutely key, because if for the first time in human history, children being born in high-income countries are very likely to live to older ages, we need to think about the life course differently. We need to construct things differently. And developing the ability to think long-term is going to be key. But I suspect it's not something we've got good social norms for, and probably not something we're hardwired for. So Dave, you got any thoughts about that one, Robert?
Yeah, it reminds me, I was hired about 10 years ago by a pensions firm, quotes unquotes, to make pensions sexy to young people, right? Quite an interesting gig. Anyway, I sort of racked my brains over this. And the only way I could get any mileage with it was to think of pensions basically as just savings that you could do fun stuff with, so don't call it pension, just call it your, like a holiday fund or a traveling fund. Anyway, but actually, it made me reflect subsequently, and Carol, you may hate me for saying this, Andrew, you may hate me for saying this. I sort of think we shouldn't be doing that. We shouldn't be preparing children born today to think long-term about the future, precisely because childhood is about not having a long-term memory. It's about being free from the responsibilities of the long term. It's about living in the moment. It's about not having developed that sense of forward view or forward vision. I mean, I don't know, maybe you know about this, Andrew, about how young children experience time. It's very striking. Toddlers have absolutely no sense of time whatsoever. If you tell them it's morning or afternoon, they just won't know. So I'd be actually rather loath, Carol, to deprive children of that extraordinary asset, which is to think everything's a blur. And I wish I could pinpoint where I read about this, but there's something about under 10-year-olds literally cannot tell the difference between a 30-year-old and an 80-year-old, or there's something like that. I mean, to them, it's just, once you get to, old, it's undifferentiated. Whereas I'm sure you know this, Andrew, as we get older, we become much more refined. We can really tell the difference between a 72-year-old and an 87-year-old. And those differences become more important to us as we get older. So sorry, Carol.
And is that also perhaps where the second childhood notion comes in? Because if you're saying children don't have a sense of future or planning or time, is that where the second childhood comes in with older people?
Yes, I think so. And of course, we don't want to deprive older people of that either. So
I think it's a bit in the middle that's the problem, because if you look at where the demographic longevity changes have come, it is an extended middle age, early old age, whatever phrase you want to use, and I think that is the challenge. But it is so, but there must be an age in adult development, perhaps not child development, but adult development, where you start to think about the long-term view. We're discussing how difficult it is through memory to remember who you were 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So doing it the other way around is going to be just incredibly hard, isn't it?
It is, though. One thing I've discovered, I gave a talk on self-reinvention a few years ago, and it feels to me that is a concept that people like. And if you mention David Bowie, people get very excited indeed, So, there are these examples of people who have reinvented themselves, and the idea of self-reinvention does seem to be one that sparks the imagination for quite a number. So, the language around all of this is so important, isn't it? Because once we start to talk about age, I think you and I have spoken about this, Andrew, old age, aging, all those terms feel a bit, heavy and a bit wearying. But if we talk about self-reinvention, suddenly we've got, this is a unusual, cool kind of concept. It's what rock stars do,
Well, it is interesting, going back to the Pindar Nietzsche quote about, become what you are. I mean, children, in some ways, when they play, become what they're not. Your midlife changes or the multi cycles, it's going to be very much perhaps about becoming what you're not.
I really like that. It's a very, not just a clever, but a wise rephrasing, Andrew, if I may say so. Becoming what you're not. And when I was thinking about doing this session with you today, I was thinking a lot about, a lot of self-help books and spiritual texts and so on. Nearly all of them. I mean, if there's one thing, as far as I can work out, that all spiritual and religious texts have in common, and here's a generalization to end all generalizations, it's that we should get rid of the ego in some way. And we mentioned the ego before. And I think, again, it's about becoming detached from too strong a sense of self, actually, because it's only a strong, overly strong sense of self, or ego, if you want to call it that prevents us from reinventing ourselves. I was thinking about during the pandemic, it's extraordinary. I was hearing the other day from a friend of mine about, she's gone to work at a COVID testing center. She was a teacher, language school. She was laid off. She went to work at a COVID testing center. At this COVID testing center, there's lots of actors who were laid off, and they've gone to work at a COVID testing center. Well, that's quite interesting, because if you thought of yourself just as an actor, you'd struggle a bit to then adapt and get a new job. You know what I mean? So this becoming who you're not, I think, really is a wise thing you've touched on there, Andrew, because it is about letting go of our identifications in some way. And a lot of in that spiritual tradition, encourages us not to become identified with our thoughts, and particularly our thoughts about who we are. And that identity is actually one of the biggest curses of the modern era. I know we're in an age of identity politics. It feels to me that for all the kind of political progress we make through identity politics in giving a voice to marginalized groups, it's also a straitjacket in some way.
I think the whole aging and longevity agenda, it touches onto identity issues really interesting. The first is, of course, in these really deeply ingrained and strongly held stereotypes about aging. So the notion that your age defines you is, of course, what we're struggling with, partly because as more people age, the sheer diversity of aging becomes all the more apparent. The different pathways people's health and experiences have taken, and you can be rich or poor if you're old. There's just not archetypes. So the diversity really hits the stereotypes. And then, of course, people are changing, as we've been sort of touching on at several points. And this notion of a midlife transition or multiple stages where you change, it's not something that society has been kind to. So you're sort of trapped in one particular role. And Kara's got a question about how we try and tackle that. But also, it's interesting because we're also looking at this in a sort of linear way of sort of what is my personal identity. And you're almost saying that, with wisdom comes the detachment of the ego and less of a sense of identity. But that fits into with these multiple changes, these notions of reinventions and change. It's funny because I hear the scientists some scientists are working on rejuvenation. And at one level, it sort of sounds extraordinary. It's a Wolverine type stuff where you just regenerate your physical body. But, the eyes have been regenerated. They're working on regenerating your lungs and livers. And, that looks like it could be physically possible. So I guess the question is, can you rejuvenate your character? Can you actually go back in time and change things? One question we got from the audience is, what's the secret to living longer, which I think, I'm not sure you're going to answer that one, Robert, but living longer and having no regrets.
Now, again, you might sort of hate me a bit on this one, but I think regrets serve a purpose. It's a bit like, do we wish we had a completely innocent life? Would you trust somebody who'd been completely innocent all their life? Could you learn from somebody who had no regrets? I mean, the experience of regret is profoundly uncomfortable. Of course it is. And there's this wonderful phrase in French, which maybe l'esprit d'escalier, the staircase spirit, where you walk away from an event or a meeting or a scene and you rewrite what just happened with words that you wish you'd said or acts that you wish you'd performed and you didn't in the moment. So, I'm not denying regrets are uncomfortable and painful, but we regret regrets because they are moments of error or mistake and so on. And so they give us information, and they give us information in a particularly acute form. And the acuteness of that form is what we call pain. So you can think of regret as, painful knowledge, which is essentially what it is, or knowledge that damages the ego in some way. And it feels to me that anything that damages the ego, to continue our theme a bit, is not wholly to be rejected. So a life without regrets, I don't, subjectively speaking, of course, we'd all wish to live a life without regrets, but do we want to be surrounded by people without regrets, without people who've never made mistakes, complete innocence? I mean, no. The people we think of who are wise in the world are probably the people with plenty of regrets.
So that's an interesting question. So let's go back to our sort of sense of wisdom and understanding. Would that then suggest that actually you would be wanting to make more mistakes as you carried on? Or would you get a point where, great, I'm not going to make any more mistakes anymore, I've arrived at wisdom? Or will I be forever refreshing and making these mistakes so I keep learning? Is that going to be a good life?
I think it's probably, this may be a clever rather than a wise answer, but I think it's probably logically impossible to consciously make a mistake, if you know what I mean. Because you'd want to, it's like Freud says, the ego can only ever do what it wants for itself to feel pleasure. But anyway, I think the point is, what you quoted Derek Parfit earlier, our erstwhile colleague. I mean, one of his main theses is that we all want life to go as well as possible. I think that's the phrase he has for all human beings. We want our life to go as well as possible. And so we will always orient ourselves towards actions which in advance look like they won't produce regret, that in fact they will produce success in some way. So what's interesting about regret is what we learn about prosecuting a course of action which caused the regret. And if I think about regrets that I have, what's, I think, perhaps common about them, and maybe even universally true about all the regrets I have, not that I'm going to enumerate them on this live session, is that even as I went into them, I did in fact have an inkling at some level that it wasn't the right thing. So when I say, can we consciously perform something that we know is going to be regretful, it's partly to say that unconsciously we always can, because I think at some level we always kind of know if we're going to do something we might regret later.
And I do at this point want to again just recommend your book Autobiophilosophy to everyone, because it's both autobiography, it's an account about relationships and how to see them and think of them, but also about philosophy. And of course, you talk both about your joys and inevitably regrets in that as well. Really fascinating. But let me come back to the questions. So Bob Walker, thank you, Bob, has raised, we're talking about time here, and we're talking about time past, time present, time future. Someone should write a Dickensian book about this. But obviously, as you go through life and as life expectancy changes, the relative balance of those three is going to change. And I think for me, that's kind of where we need a sort of theory of aging, because if we're living longer and we're older than before, but we have more time ahead of us, how do we make a sense of all of that? And particularly in economics, it's very forward-looking. The past pins down your circumstances, and forward-looking is kind of where you want to end up. But Bob asked the questions, which I think is a really interesting one. Can we live in the moment and remember the past at the same time? Or do they compete with each other the older we get? And that older one is interesting, because I'd also perhaps flip it around and say, can we live in the moment if we're planning for the future? But presumably as you get older, you have something of a rebalance. So Robert, I don't know if you have thoughts on that question.
Yeah, well, now that we've touched on the theme of sort of spiritual books and all the rest of it, I go immediately to this famous book called The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, which is a very famous sort of spiritual guide. And he basically says, we must live in the now, must live in the moment. And it's one of the principal textbooks, I suppose, of the mindfulness movement, which perhaps Bob's question is partly a reference to. And one of the things Eckhart Tolle tries to wrestle with is precisely this question, because if his advice is live in the moment, but we're kind of radically in the moment, like as if you're meditating, because the process of meditation, contrary to maybe people who've not done it, I don't meditate, by the way, although I went through a period of doing so. The process of meditation is one actually of being very present, not very detached. You're there in the moment, and the idea is you switch off your thoughts and you hear what's going on around you or in the room or whatever it might be. So how can you do that and be thinking about either the past, Bob's question, or the future, Andrew's question? And Eckhart Tolle sort of, maybe this is a clever rather than a wise answer, he squares that circle by saying, you stay in the present, but your thoughts themselves become like objects in the room, which you just see passing before your eyes, or like watching the traffic. There's a famous meditation app called Headspace now, which does counsels people to do exactly this. When you have a thought, you don't become identified with it. You just say, oh, look, there's a thought about my past, or oh, look, there's a thought about my future, literally as if you were watching the traffic go by. So I think that is, you can argue with this, Bob, and Andrew, you'll have your own views as well. But I suppose that is the trick, that proper presence, ironically, means becoming detached, and detached to the point whereby even what you're thinking, the thoughts themselves, because we think of our thoughts as being sort of in here, like sort of behind our eyes, at the center of our consciousness, and basically those thoughts being identical with who I am. I am my thoughts here and now. So I'm looking at Andrew, I can see he's thinking, he and his thoughts are sort of one and the same phenomenon, if you see what I mean. And I'm experiencing that now. I, Robert, sort of thinking, my thoughts are me. But what Tolle and others say is, well, actually, your thoughts aren't you. If you live properly in the moment, you can think of your thoughts objectively as though it's just a performance taking place, generated by your, well, to use that word again, generated by your ego, I suppose, in some way. And the same goes for the future, thoughts about the future.
It's interesting. I want to link this in with a question from Christopher Carr in the chat, which is, I think, a really interesting one, which is about society's pressure into identifying people as being old. And, you sort of said the power of being in the moment. And, I think that sounds great, and one that should be relevant at all ages. But society does want old people to be in the past, that sort of this sense of generational conflict, that old people, their times are gone, their knowledge is out of date and irrelevant. So they're not in the now. So I wonder if that's one of the big challenges about adjusting to longevity and this increasing number of older people, a sort of resentment that older people should be focusing on the now.
Yeah, this is a complex one, isn't it? We're at a moment in time, aren't we? Of course, and we always will be, but we are at a moment in time whereby, because the discourse around identity is so strong at the moment, there are different identities and groups which are coming into prominence and others falling away and so on. I like to think that what that really means is that there will be a new pluralism, essentially. That rather than this being around correcting for this or that this will give us a new tolerance to understand the specificity of lots of different groups, be it old, young, or whatever category they're in. And that although I'm very skeptical in all sorts of ways about identity politics, one of the advantages, I think, is that in theory, at least, it could build tolerance. And if it builds tolerance, then in principle, of course, tolerance being tolerance, should also tolerate older people who have been, excluded, overlooked, considered, redundant in some ways from the practice of society, from the practice of civil life and so on. So maybe that's a slightly sentimental view of what's going on, but that's what I'd like to think is happening.
Clearly I mean, given also the fall in the fertility rate and people living for longer, for the first time ever, we're going to have more people above 50 or 60 than under, which means society will be structured differently. Often that's seen as wrong. I then always say the question, well, when society was the majority of young people, was that necessarily better than the majority of old people, which comes back to this question of wisdom. And of course, there is a fundamental asymmetry with time. We've been talking about looking to the future and looking back, but the old can presumably have some recollection of being young, and even if it's not a faithful one, but the young could never quite know about being old. And I think that's where I think this is sort of that understanding the other is a challenge, because going back to the question earlier by Carol, how do we get younger people to truly understand that they will themselves be old one day, to reach to that otherness. And I think the other part of Christopher's question is looking at Oxbridge, which is sort of forcing retirement. I think at 67, I think it forces retirement for academics. How do we sort of find a role? Because it is, traditionally society has tended to venerate those who reach older ages and seen them as being wise. But as more and more people get to old age, I don't know if it's a lack of scarcity value or a sense that they've done it not through wisdom, but just through NHS and the sort of various interventions. It's not obvious that respect is there. And I think partly that's about technology. I forget where I think Pat Thane has a really interesting point that in the days before widespread literacy, older people were seen as being very wise because they were the repository of knowledge. But once literacy and publications came into view, then actually that ceased to be the case. And I think that's an interesting one. Julia's Randall Khan, hi Julia, has got a question. With longer life, do you see, Robert, the need for more rituals as we move through different stages of life? Because of course transitions are much helped by rituals. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, Julia, I love this, absolutely love this question. And I mean, it sounds like one of the blandest statements ever, but I'm a big fan of ritual. And I don't think it should be restricted either to later life or vice versa. I've been doing some work with some organizations recently in my sort of consulting capacity, which are going through transitions, hiring and firing people. And one of the things that I've been doing with a couple of them is designing rituals around joining and leaving organizations. And it's remarkable how powerful those are, actually. Of course, we have informal rituals. There's when people leave, there's the card, good luck, and there's the silly jokes, and the card gets passed around the office, and then maybe there's a whip round and so on. And we have induction processes for people who join, but that they are significant. They are significant moments. And one of the things I like about ritual is that they do produce meaning. I was trying to say something earlier about what we get meaning from in life, relationship and purpose. And ritual, I suppose, is another form in which we derive meaning. But it's very interesting what the status of meaning is in ritual, because it's not something that can be translated into anything. You can't say, what does the ritual of, getting married mean, or what does the ritual of leaving a job mean? And so other than saying it's meaningful, because there's something about ritual which occurs at the collective level. I mean, individuals have rituals and so on. Anyway, the short answer to the question is yes, absolutely. And if only we had more, if only we had more of them, and had a way of recognizing the value that they bring. Actually, I guess it's, it feels like it's one of the aspects of modernity to be skeptical about ritual, but actually I think we lose a lot by losing ritual.
I think that fits into Carol's earlier question about how we help people in midlife with change. That does seem to be an area where the rituals are most needed, and where a new stage of adult development is coming through. We are going to have to call this to a halt now. I know you and I, Robert, Karen, for a long while. Thank you everyone for joining in. Thank you for the questions. Thank you to Robert for your time. And just before we go, we're just going to put up some information about our next Longevity Forum event with Father Michael, intriguingly called Sarah the Milkmaid and Blossom the Cow, which for those of you who know is an awful lot to do with longevity. But Jab 1, it's all about the history of vaccines, but that's our next event coming up 10th of June. So please do register once you've bought Robert's wonderful book, Autobiography. So thank you.